Thank you for inviting us for this project. We are members of Decolonize This Place. I'm Natasha, this is Amin, there's Mars, and there's Amy. And we're excited about this conversation. Specifically, if we think about heritage and the idea of time, we all believe in non-linear time or this idea of the thick now, where the past, present, and future kind of collapse into one, right? That the past is also about our future and the present. That's the idea that we think about heritage, that heritage is not something from the past, it's active today, but also is a limited framework to think about our lives. Similarly to climate change, because if we look at movements of decolonization that specifically come from people who are doing land defense of territories from capitalism and colonialism, we know that climate change is also related to the defense of land, water, and air, and how specifically governments and corporate interests have been extracting that, right? And so for us, climate change is not separate from movements of land back, movements of abolition of prisons and borders, because currently what we are facing is a very big challenge on a planetary scale, right? So before I pass it on to Mars, yeah, I just want to say that climate change and heritage are perhaps a limited framework of looking at the kind of struggle that we have ahead of us, and are perhaps a more coming more from a Western philosophical context, and it might be time to open up even the way we think about climate change in our practices of research science and organizing, because most often these concepts are also looked under the framework of nation states, and the idea of nation states in itself also comes from Westphalian civilization. So as democracy is failing, as nation states are failing, we have to look at each other in different parts of the world and see who are the people who are fighting for defense of land, water, and air, and that is climate change, right? That is climate change defense, and that is the defense of heritage as well, because whose knowledges are the ones getting abolished at this very moment. So
Dope. Um, so I think when I think about this idea of heritage as narratives of climate change, I'm thinking who inherits what from like a multi-species perspective. So on one hand, we've been taught through sci-fi and other kind of crazy genres that the end of the world is like everybody at once, right? Like the asteroid or the aliens or the robots or the zombies are going to kill us all at the same time. The problem with that is that it doesn't consider capitalism, racism, colonization, imperialism, meaning that climate change isn't something in the future, or the end of the world isn't something in the future, but it's something that's happening right now for a lot of people, right? So when we see tons and tons, I mean, tens, hundreds of thousands of tons, if not more, of bombs being dropped on Gaza, that's a domicide, right? So it's not just a genocide, but it's something that corrupts the land around it. You can't be surprised then when you see fires happening elsewhere or earthquakes or other cataclysms. And so these people who are experiencing earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, tsunamis, they're at the front line of really seeing how climate change is affecting folks, right? And so when I think about this from a decolonial and abolitionist kind of framework, uh, I think that like we need to center those folks that are most affected, right? So how do we privilege those people? How do we privilege the fact that birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, all these mammals, all these different animals are also affected? What do we do about those different things? Everything needs to be abolished. All these systems, in order for true healing to happen from a person to person, community to community, but also like species to species standpoint, then we need to not have genocide, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, all these things that are actively ruining the earth. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
So I think the only thing I would add is like in thinking about heritage and climate, it makes me think about like what are we asking and like what are we talking about? And so the way I see it is we're talking about how we relate with each other in the world, right? So it's like our relation to our current time and place with each other. I think about um, how are we working to actually liberate people and planet? And how is our work a piece of a larger whole? No matter where we are, whether we're in New York, Spain, Mexico, Palestine, right? Because it is a planetary movement and struggle. Um, and so, right, I think it brings up questions of our relations to land, with each other, all living and non-living things. And how do we make the world that we want, that is about life and liberation and connects back to the land?
Yeah, and just to add, I think that, thinking about heritage and climate change, I think like these are concepts that are embedded with certain ideologies of a diagnosis of a problem and then what people think are the solutions. And I think what Mars and Amy are pointing to is that it requires everyone, and we're not in similarly situated positions. And needs to be an analysis around class and how that's impacting people. The other thing is like this becomes important because the worldview that's dominant and that's being kind of enforced by violence is one of capitalism and modernity. And this is one that is only one way of living, but it's being imposed on all of us. The consequences of that are death to the planet and death to those who don't assimilate. The problem, though, is that Western civilization as a whole is in crisis. It has brought us to this point. Um, I want to say something just about colonization. Colonization is just capitalism with violence. And now you could see this, for example, whether it's imperialism or whatever, these are forms of violence that actually get imported in other places to open markets and take land. And not take land because someone else is more deserving of it. Take lands for mega projects in which they take away your food sovereignty and then give you some dumbass jobs that actually kill you in the process. Where does that happen? Whether they're in a country called the United States or they're in a country called Palestine, there's going to be people on top and people on the bottom. We want to be with the people on the bottom because that's going to produce and usher in a different kind of world in which many worlds can exist. And that shouldn't be unrealistic or unreasonable, because what's unrealistic and crazy is that people think that we need to accept the planet dying and dumbass solutions like green transition being a solution to death and destruction, when in fact it's actually just another way of colonization and another way of taking from people who are weak, who don't have much, and giving it to the people who have more. So they're promising us that they'll actually have a better future for us. What is the us? They get to decide. So, the fight for life and non-life is one that cannot rely on capitalism, cannot rely on their solutions, must rely on us, and must actually defend this option.